protections for news gathering in the other space that are both important to what's happening here. Jeff, I'm interested in hearing what you think as a doctrinal matter about the press clause being more load bearing, but I also wonder if you have thoughts on the opportunities and challenges of kind of crafting this doctrine in our new media landscape. The previous panels in this conference have really honed in on the fact that preserving and protecting the core press functions is just as important as ever before, if not more so. And so I'm just wondering what kind of lessons you think we can draw from earlier doctrine speaking to this that might be galvanized to protect our modern news gathering terrain.
Well, the first thing I'd say is that when the question arises about what is the press clause about, one of the striking things is that the Supreme Court 30 years ago in the Brandsburg versus Hayes case, 50 years ago, I meant, basically washed its hands of holding laws unconstitutional under the press clause because it didn't want the responsibility of deciding who was the press. And it therefore essentially has walked away from that. And the press clause has rarely been used to invalidate laws on the grounds that the laws violate the press, unless the laws themselves are directed specifically at the press. But in a situation like Brandsburg, where a reporter wanted a exemption from having to answer questions at a trial because of a supposed First Amendment press clause privilege, reporter's privilege, the court basically said, no, we're not going to go there. And its primary reason was not wanting to decide who is the press and who's not the press. And if you give special privileges to the press under the First Amendment, you inevitably have to then decide, does that include not only the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, but does it include people who have blogs online and high school newspapers and people who write pamphlets and want to put them online? And the court just doesn't want to be in the business of having to decide as a constitutional matter who is the press and who's not the press. And so it's basically thus far walked away from that otherwise seemingly obvious possible interpretation of the press clause. And whether that will change over time, I don't know, but it does pose what I would regard as an extremely difficult question in terms of figuring out who gets a privilege because they are the press as a constitutional matter. On the other hand, the recognition of the importance of the press from a constitutional standpoint can enable the court to give deference to legislative decisions by state and federal government that give particular rights and privileges to the press as they define the press. So 49 states have journalist privileges in which they make the decision that the Supreme Court didn't want anything to do with. As statutory matters, the 49 states adopt a definition of who gets to assert the journalist privilege, and it varies across different states. And the courts have not wanted to get into the business of saying, no, that definition is too narrow or it's too broad. And basically, they've given deference to the states. So I think one of the concerns that the justices had in Brandsburg and have continued to have since is, how do you enforce the press clause insofar as the press wants special privileges because they are the press? And that's in fact a very difficult constitutional question. And the court usually tries to stay away from that. On the other hand, as I said, I think the court is likely to be quite comfortable with laws that define who the press is for purposes of specific benefits, as in the journalist privilege situation, and won't second guess that as long as they don't have any reason to believe that it's either explicitly or implicitly based on viewpoint of who the press is. So I think those are two ways in which the potential effect of the press clause up to this point has played out.
Yeah, thanks. That's super helpful. And Sonja, I know that you've written a lot about sort of this question of whether whether we might hone in for press clause purposes, and particularly might need to do so in an era in which a legacy media model largely dissolves, right? And we move forward with news gathering and investigative journalism happening in a different space than it was happening in a boots on the ground way for the court that was deciding Brandsburg, for example. And if you've sort of talked a little about the notion of honing in on the press function, right? Sort of what the core press functions are and the way that the press clause could be galvanized to protect those engaging in the press function as compared to something institutional that we would label the press. I'm wondering if you can just sort of tease out for us what those functions would be. Sort of what, in a really concrete way, what specifically are the sorts of functions that anybody, whoever's engaging in them, would be doing that you would link up to being the kinds of things that you might envision as protected within the press clause?
Sure. And, first of all, I completely agree with Jeff that both the justices themselves, as well as a fair number of other, scholars and commentators, have found the definitional issue about how we would figure out who or who isn't the press for constitutional purposes, to be the final obstacle, to be sort of the thing that makes us need to kind of throw up our hands and walk away from this whole endeavor. I'm really looking forward to the next panel solving it all for us, so we can check that off our to-do list. But I'm also highly skeptical of it being quite the insurmountable problem that so many have made it out to be. Constitutional interpretation is hard. The Constitution's filled with ambiguity of all sorts of terms, for which there are not black and white answers, for which we have loads of gray areas. Yet nonetheless, we seem to just sort of venture on in fearlessly and tackle those problems rather than saying, oh, we must now just abandon this entire sort of pretty explicit part of our Constitution. And as an example, I was really taken by a case that the court decided in I think it was 2011, the Hosanna Tabor case, where they were tasked with trying to figure out who had First Amendment rights under the free exercise clause for religion to function as a minister for a free exercise clause. So who were these constitutional rights holders who could claim these exemptions, in that case from Americans from Disability Act requirements? And, the court didn't sit there and say, oh, well, we could never, say who is in and who is out. Oh, we could never come up with a definition. Rather, they just, again, ventured on in and tackled the problem and said, well, here's some things we know about what ministers tend to do. Here's the functions they tend to have. Now let's look at the teacher that's involved in this case. Was she filling those functions? Did she seem to have, and here are some proxies that we tend to rely on to know whether we have an actor here who seems to be fulfilling these functions that we're very confident the Constitution meant to protect, and we're not, we can't just wash our hands of our obligation to figure this out. And so that's what they did, right? They said this isn't going to be perfect. We might have to continue this conversation in the future, as they have, but nonetheless, went forward. And so I think a similar approach is completely doable for when it comes to the press. If you look at the totality of the cases and opinions we've gotten from the court where they talk about the press, as you've written, RonNell, as they've talked about the press in dicta, which they, at least for a period there, really love to do, to sort of every opportunity to talk about the press as a thing, as a separate entity, not as the act of publishing, but rather as an institution that existed, that was populated by people. And they would give us this dicta. And if you really go through it, you really find two primary functions, which is that they tell us that the press informs the public about matters of public concern. So it has this element of reaching a wide audience. I would say doing so sort of on a regular and reliable manner, would be the actors who are fulfilling this effectively. And then checks the government and the powerful, that we need to have surrogates for the public. We need to have the eyes and the ears for the public. We need to have a press that brings a certain level of government expertise or resources so that they can effectively check the government on our behalf in a way that we can't all just do, using our own personal Twitter accounts, that there's something special that's going on there. And so, like the court did with the approach to figuring out who's a minister, to me, I feel like we start with those functions and try to identify the actors or entities that are fulfilling those functions, but do so, in a similar manner as they did in Hasana Tabor, accepting that there are proxies, accepting that, this may be an imperfect line that we are drawing. And again, to end where I started with the good news, bad news, the good news is, though, under this type of approach, everybody, whether they are considered on one line or the other of this analysis, maintains these robust speech rights that allow us to get our viewpoints out, allow us to speak and to publish and to broadcast, and so and reach a broad audience. So we don't have the concern there about sort of shutting out voices if we have a bit of imperfect constitutional line drawing.
Martha, it occurs to me that a sort of pulsating theme of Your Saving the News book is also sort of focused on this notion that there are some core functions that must have been envisioned as press functions that animated the inclusion of the press clause and that need to for lack of a better word, right, that sustain the democracy, right, that sort of hold us together in those spaces. Do you have something to add to this? What sorts of functions do you think would fall within that space as core press functions?
Well, I do like Sonja's point that we don't have to have perfect sets when, in a mathematical sense, when law defines functions or gives definitions. And so in that spirit, I think accountability, holding government figures and other powerful figures to account is a major function. Accountability journalism is often described. Investigative journalism is another name. Information, I think during COVID-19, we've all seen the significance of having reliable information and local information, as the last panel also discussed. I think that there's also, Ethan, I think made wonderful points about creating a forum for discussion. This may be less important as there are many other places where a forum may exist, but it certainly has had that function in the past. But those are the key ones that I would identify.
I want to tee up for you all based on some questions that people have placed in the Q&A and chat and sent to me. We have a companion set of questions that have to do with the U.S. Supreme Court and and with the courts more generally, sort of the judicial role in all of this. And so I'm going to ask them both together, and then maybe have Jeff take the first of them, and Sonja chime in on the second. But if others have other views, I'd love to hear them. The first is from Genevieve Lakier. There's currently a lot of skepticism about judicial power. When panelists invoke a more expansive press clause, do they assume that it will be judicially enforced? Do they want that, given the very laissez-faire view of constitutional liberty embraced by the court right now? Tornillo does not inspire me to want more press clause decision-making by the courts. And the second question that I want to pose to Sonja, sort of piggyback on that, after maybe Jeff answers that, is just the sort of broader question of how amenable might the current Supreme Court be to an invigorated press clause doctrine. Jeff, do you want to speak to this sort of the diciness of judicial intervention here? And then Sonja, maybe on a more concrete level about how to read the tea leaves from the current Supreme Court?
Well, I have to admit that I am not confident in the current Supreme Court interpreting the Constitution in the way that I think it should be interpreted across a wide range of issues. And I worry that they are, in many respects, more focused on the political outcomes of particular decisions and the political implications of decisions in a particular direction than they are, in my view, on the basic principles of the Constitution itself. And examples of cases like Citizens United and not striking down gerrymandering and holding the Voting Rights Act unconstitutional. These are examples of many other decisions as well, in which if you look at the pattern of the decisions, not just any one of them, but if you look at the pattern of the decisions, it's hard to escape the conclusion that there is a set of motives driving the justices that have nothing to do with originalism and nothing to do, frankly, with a neutral form of constitutional interpretation. And whether they're aware of it or not, I do think that they are interpreting these provisions in ways that benefit their own particular political views. This is deeply troubling as someone who is committed to the Supreme Court as an essential component of our governance structure. But I do think it's the reality today. And given the current structure of the Supreme Court, the current makeup of the Supreme Court, I would like to see aggressive judicial deference as the approach that the court takes across the boards. But I therefore don't trust them, frankly, to decide the kinds of issues we're talking about in a way that would serve the interests of the nation or the values of the First Amendment. I hate saying that, but it's an honest statement about where I think we are.
Yeah, Sonja, thoughts and specifics about the current court's likelihood of embracing such a doctrinal shift?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that with both Genevieve and Jeff that there, it definitely seems at the moment that there are reasons to be a bit pessimistic about the current court. First, a response to the first question, to Genevieve's question, which is, I will say that I do have concerns not only about, whether we are happy with, having judicial control and judicial deference about, giving affirmative rights and protections to the press. But I also have concerns, as again, I know Genevieve shares, about the trend of the court's jurisprudence on sort of free speech, free expression, generally toward this increasingly content neutrality, speaker neutrality absolutism, right? That where, nobody can make any kind of distinction between any kind of speaker who is producing any kind of content versus other speakers, because while this is not the scenario we have quite seen yet, the groundwork there is being laid, the logic there is being laid that could very arguably, I think, put some doubt on the ability of the political branches to be able to come in and provide these unique rights of access, or these benefits, or in some cases these subsidies or protections that we have been talking about being many of these answers, if they don't also provide them to non-press speakers, because we could have this issue of having some form of speaker identification or discrimination that would in of itself be some kind of constitutional violation. And of course, these are things we have a long history of. These are things I would absolutely argue are constitutional, but I have concerns about sort of the jurisprudential shift we are seeing in some of these other levels. But also, going to your second question, RonNell, about our outlook with the current Supreme Court. Here, I have to think about the empirical project that RonNell and I just finished doing. We just recently posted our first piece based on this project, but it was a large-scale empirical project where we coded every reference to the press and to press freedom in every opinion that had been written by a Supreme Court justice since 1784. We had almost 9,000 total characterizations or references to the press in our study. And then we coded these paragraphs for a variety of different frames, and then also for the tone of the reference, whether it was positive, neutral, or negative. And one of the frames we used was keeping track of their references to the constitutional right of press freedom itself, whether they talked about the liberty of the press or freedom of the press or press freedom, or however they might have worded it. And our findings were very discouraging. We really have found that in the last 50 years, there's been this dramatic decline in the pure references the court is making to the right even existing, let alone to having these sort of positive references to the right that we might have seen back, say, in the 1960s and 70s. It used to be very regularly mentioned. It used to be what RonNell and I've been calling a traveling companion, a very common traveling companion to freedom of speech. They would say, oh, you know, under First Amendment's protections for freedom of speech or of the press, now that or of the press part seems to be just disappearing. And now we're just having the focus be on freedom of speech. And among the current court, we really have a group of justices, regardless of their ideology, who are simply not talking about this as being a right really at all, let alone giving it any kind of significance. So that does definitely give us reasons to not be completely optimistic about where we are with the current court.
Can I add one further thought to that? I don't know if you guys have seen it yet, but the DC Circuit handed down a decision very recently about a libel action, and Justice Lawrence Silberman dissented in the case. Silberman, of course, is a longstanding, very conservative, now senior judge, and echoing Clarence Thomas, he called for New York Times v. Sullivan to be overruled. But his reason for doing so was not so much an originalist argument, but was rather that New York Times and Sullivan, in his view, was designed to enable the liberal press to engage in abusive attacks on conservatives. And that is completely distorting American public discourse, and we need to get rid of it so as to be able to control the irresponsibility of the liberal press. And that was, he said, literally in the opinion. I just found that shocking.
Yeah, I saw secondary reports of that and assumed that the summaries that I was reading about them were hyperbole. And then when I clicked through to read the actual opinion itself, it says in those exact words. It is, I think it, I mean, just sort of speaking as somebody who reads a lot of opinions from a lot of courts about the press, it felt like a tonal shift, a stark tonal shift that maps onto the kind of tonal shift that Sonja was just describing. Martha, did you want to chime in on that? Did you have a...
I'm not going to comment about that particular dissent. I do note that the same judge made quite a remarkable comment about the proposed removal of Confederate statues. So he seems to be worked up about a lot of things right now. The comment that I wanted to make was that I share the concern and the worries about what I guess is being called the Lochnerizing of the First Amendment, and the Supreme Court seems to have found, at least a majority of its members through the First Amendment, a device to knock down any regulatory action that it doesn't like. And that's very disturbing. On the other hand, and this is a direct response to Genevieve, I think that the attention to the First Amendment, and notably the press clause, would be helpful in reminding the court not to knock down initiatives that are meant to strengthen the press, which at the moment it just might do.
Yeah, sort of the taking advantage of the Lochnerization in a way that acknowledges this as a baseline background. I think that's interesting. Okay, this is the point in the panel where I had wanted to turn to sort of concrete real world litigation strategies, places where this this conference just has a real goal of doing some concrete thinking about solutions and next steps. And for this panel, I think a part of what that means is sussing out the regulations and cases and fact patterns that might provide the best opportunities for presenting some of these conceptual or theoretical frameworks to the courts, to the lower courts. And a couple of people have asked questions in the chat and the Q&A about sort of real world examples. What are real world examples of how the press clause could be used to protect the press? That is, sort of what's a fact pattern where the clause would do something that was different from the speech clause. I want to throw out a couple of questions for you all about current events that have sort of come up that have raised this question, but I also want you to sort of keep in mind that bigger question. If you have an example to share, I'd love to hear it. We've seen, just as a sort of starting example, several recent high-profile cases involving attacks on or arrests of journalists covering protest, the Portland case before the Ninth Circuit, the prosecution of the journalist in Iowa. Are these cases involving news gatherers and news gathering the best avenues for asserting these values? Are there other contexts that are going to sort of tee up strategic presentation of some of these concepts? What do you all have in mind? Sonja, give us some concrete examples of a time when an invocation of the press clause would make a difference in a real world First Amendment case.
Right, sure. I mean, I think that the cases you started are absolutely great places for us to begin our thinking. I think our focus should be just on these areas where we really have the press, we have these unique speakers who are fulfilling these unique roles that are different from other types of speakers, and they are doing so, as public surrogates. They are doing so as, fulfilling this function that works on our collective best interests. And we have a situation where they are in need of some kind of right and protection in order to do this work that is simply different from the rights or protections that other speakers may either need or not need at that moment. So when you have journalists at a protest and there is a general dispersal order, there's of course a government need to have people follow these orders, to have a dispersal of people who might be there for other reasons. But the photojournalist, for example, who is there to document for us what the government is doing, what law enforcement is doing at that moment, needs to stay, and he needs to have unique rights and protections that are different from the other members of that crowd. Putting to our different analysis how we would think about rights of assembly and petition, right? But that we have these press interests that are going on, this constitutional press function that is going on, and that needs to be part of our analysis when we are thinking about the constitutional role, the constitutional protection. We need, I think, more than just hoping for the good graces of law enforcement or hoping for the good graces of the government officials who are making decisions about who can stay or who can go. I often think too about the right of access, more recently as a recent example, to the immigration detention facilities that we have had so much focus on, particularly that we had focus on in the middle of the Trump administration, where we were really at the mercy of the government in terms of what kinds of access we were able to get as the public. I'm saying we as the public collectively, we had a very strong interest in knowing what was going on inside those immigration detention centers, yet the press had no right of access. We couldn't get photojournalists inside to take pictures. Sometimes some were leaked. The Trump administration themselves nicely offered to give us, gave us very curated photos, right? That's obviously unacceptable, right? We needed to have representatives of the public. They also understandably can't open the doors to the immigration facility to allow anybody and who wants to come in. That's not workable. So we have another situation where we can't give the right to everybody. We can't give the protection to everybody, but we have this press function. The public needs to know, and we need to identify who are at least some of the speakers who can fulfill this role. We need to ensure that this role is being filled and that we have a constitutional right as the public to have those journalists have access in order to be able to check the government and to bring the information, the important information, back to us.
As I said at the outset, the only reason to me that makes any sense for not creating a First Amendment right for members of the press to have special access to a whole range of different situations is this problem of constitutional definition of the press. On the other hand, I think that a lot of these issues can be resolved by getting lawmakers to understand that this is important. And if in most respects, they actually do allow the press to go to places and to get information. But I do think that some of this can be addressed by persuading lawmakers, as they have been, for example, on the idea of a journalist privilege. Since 49 of the 50 states adopted that by statute. that this is a simpler way of addressing the question. I do think that the court should find that there are First Amendment rights of journalists to have access to a whole range of information. But I also, when I imagine myself writing the opinion, I, in fact, also get stuck on the question of how does anyone decide who gets this privilege as a constitutional matter as opposed to a statutory matter. Yeah, the Iowa case, which you mentioned, is interesting because the woman reporter did not have her reporting ID with her at the time. And the question then is, well, can you just tell a police officer in the middle of a protest when all the people are being told to move away and assuming that's appropriate, that I'm a reporter when you don't even have your credentials to identify yourself in that way? That just struck me as an idiosyncratic factor in the case, which was kind of interesting.
Yes, in their immense wisdom, the organizers of this conference knew for a certainty that this conversation would lead to that conversation. The sort of who counts as the press question, it just inevitably emerges anytime there's a question about invigorating the press clause. And so I hope that attendees and panelists will see the two as companion pieces, that as companion panels that will be able to sort of think about both. Because I think the sets of things that Jeff's talking about here really matter both as to the definitional question and as to the substance, right? They're intertwined in ways that are that we've sort of artificially parsed here, but that I think come up sort of along the way in terms of thinking about litigation strategy and also thinking about the viability of it as a constitutional doctrine. Martha, there's a question here in the Q&A that loops back to something that you were saying earlier. The questioner says, in the last panel, there was a suggestion that the Justice Department could block acquisitions of newspaper chains by hedge funds on the grounds that it hurts localism. It's possible the court could say that violates the First Amendment by affecting the makeup of the press. Do you think that the approach outlined by Professor Minow could provide the undergirding for that kind of action?
So with thanks for that question, because I do think it's a wonderful illustration of the approach that I'm suggesting. And while appropriately, you've been asking about what are the litigation strategies to affirmatively build out the meaning of the press, I'm very much focused on what are the approaches that could inform the actions of other branches of government. And then in defending those activities from any challenges in the courts, the press clause could be used. So I do think that whether it's with regard to antitrust action or frankly, taxation, proposed taxation, for example, of big platforms, and I think that that can be defended without having comparable taxation of supposedly competitor news organizations. And I similarly think that there could be defenses of spending, which also might be, and subsidies that might be challenged again by certain aggressive views of the First Amendment. So I do think so. I think that the private equity acquisition issue is a little tough because is it going to be under a what's the heading of review? Is it antitrust? There's not just a roving review of any kind of purchasing going on, but there certainly is a strip mining going on in this country of what look like steady subscriptions coming in from local newspapers, and then the private equity comes in and basically destroys the reporting base. And then, of course, the subscriptions dry up, but by then the investors have moved on. So there's a serious problem here. There should be regulation. And yes, I think the press clause gives a defense of some efforts.
Yeah, and so is it accurate, Martha, to be suggesting that part of what you're thinking about the role here would be sort of the press clause as a First Amendment retort to a First Amendment challenge to a governmental action? That is, when we have a statutory or regulatory effort, a First Amendment pushback, and then a sort of broader First Amendment lens that would require the press clause to be taken into account in that wider calculation. Is that what's happening here?
That's absolutely part of it, but in just perfect harmony actually with what Jeff said before. I'm also thinking that there are other actors besides the United States Supreme Court or courts in general to whom the First Amendment is addressed. And those include the people in legislatures, executives, people in regulatory agencies, and they should be acting in the spirit of the not only the freedom of speech clause, but also the press clause.
Dave Schultz has a question, and I think he's here in our panelist group. And so if he wants to answer it, ask it live, that would be great. Dave, are you there? Yeah, hi.
I can do that. I wasn't expecting to, but you know, my question in thinking about what the First Amendment specifically guarantees through the press clause, there's two things. I just wanted to comment on something Sonja said about access rights, because it's interesting. In the very first case to recognize a constitutional access right, press enterprise, Chief Justice Berger, who surprisingly went around along with finding a new right after he was put on the court to stop it from finding new rights. He said, you know, it doesn't really matter whether we call this access right a news gathering right or a right of access, because it functions the same way. I think it does matter because it affects how we think about it. And what's happened, I think, over time is the court, and particularly Judge Berger in a concurrence, or maybe it was a majority opinion in Bellotti, goes out of his way to say that the press clause really just deals with dissemination. And he like throws news gathering under the bus as something we should care about for the press clause. But so my question, one question in terms of thinking about where this comes up, there are state laws now, for example, one in Texas that my clinic at Yale is litigating that puts restrictions on the use of drones, right? It's a law of general applicability, but it has a huge impact on news gatherers. They can't use drones to get pictures of flooding in hurricanes or disasters or all sorts of ways that inhibits their ability to gather the news. And the question was, is that the type of area where litigation over an independent meaning for the press clause, you know, that even laws of general applicability may violate the press clause if they have more than an incidental burden on the ability to gather news?
Well, I don't know if that's for me, but I completely agree that there's no doubt that it's the news gathering side of the work of the press that is the most currently under protected, that we have, you know, all these instances, whether it's access to a physically, you know, governmentally controlled place like a detention center, or, you know, some certain meetings, or to, as we saw a couple of years ago, right, to a white member of the White House press corps having their access to the White House and to a presidential briefing being revoked under grounds that were highly suspicious, or whether it's being a journalist who's engaged in the act of news gathering and having their emails or their phone lines surveilled, secretly surveilled by the government. These are all things that go to the act of news gathering. It's not about anybody saying what you can or can't publish, or, you know, punishing you for a story that you published, but rather purposely interfering with this initial step. And it's the step that's clearly extremely vital for the press to be healthy and to be effective, again, in furtherance of our sort of collective interests in order to have a healthy functioning press, as we have been talking about. So, you know, I completely agree with you, Dave, that to me, again, the drone is a great example where there might be perfectly valid government reasons to have restrictions on the use of drones more generally that I think we could easily all imagine, but we need to counter that. And part of this analysis needs to be the countervailing interest and need for journalists to be able to use them in certain ways in order to get, you know, to fulfill these functions, to make sure these functions are fulfilled, that we get this information that is needed and important and part of our public dialogue.
I agree with that as a policy matter. The problem with it is once you open the door to that, the question then is, can reporters engage in burglary to get information? Can they bribe public officials to get information? You know, there's an endless list of crimes that are not directed at reporters, which then they say, I can do this because I'm a reporter. And the question is, what does that jurisprudence can look like once you open the door to it. Again, I'm completely sympathetic to the idea that there should be certain privileges, but I worry a lot about how that jurisprudence would actually work out if we open the door to that and to sort of try to go down that road.
So in that spirit, I know that drone journalists are debating whether there could be a code of ethics for drone journalism. And I know that one of the sticking points is whether violating the law would be permitted under such a code of ethics. And I guess just as a prudential matter, I would not recommend saying that drone journalism means, yes, you would have an exemption from otherwise existing federal aviation administration laws or other kinds of laws. So, you know, sometimes news gathering does involve breaking the law, but again, that's not something that I would offer as an ethical code.
I'll just jump in to say that if I ruled the world, it wouldn't be breaking the law. That's part of my point, right? That there would be sort of a baked-in exception that it simply would not, would not be constitutional for there to be restrictions on certain uses. But of course, this is all, a number of different scenarios that we need to sort out. It's on these kinds of conversations that I often go back to a great line from David Andersen, who's done such influential work in this area, that part of the problem is we started this conversation 200 years too late, and I think there's a lot of validity to that we there's a lot of sort of nooks and corners of this conversation that at some point we'll need to figure out. But to me, it doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't value in still going down that road.
One of the interesting aspects of current jurisprudence in this regard is that in two different situations. One is which, if somebody violates the law to give the press information, the person who violates the law can be punished, but the reporter, knowing it was stolen, has a right to publish it. So that's one place where the press privilege is given considerable weight, the press right. The other unanswered question is, what if the journalist violates the law to get the information? He can be punished for violating the law under existing jurisprudence, but can you then prevent the publication of the information? So if say in the Pentagon Papers case, if it hadn't been Daniel Ellsberg, but it had been a journalist who broke into the Pentagon, stole the papers, gave them to the New York Times, and the Times published it, you could presumably punish the journalist, but does that mean the Times can be published if they knew that it was stolen by the journalist rather than stolen by Ellsberg? We don't have an answer to that, at least in Supreme Court jurisprudence, but I would think the court would basically separate the publication part of it from the underlying illegal act part of it, the way it did in the Pentagon Papers.
I think that distinction between the non-press person and the press can help a little bit in this discussion about who counts as press. Because you think back to the founding era, who counted as press was who had access to the machine. But there were all kinds of people who would never be identified as journalists who were writing things that got published. And we're somewhat back to that world now with the internet. Everybody can publish, but who has access to the infrastructure? That's the kind of thing, again, that Ethan Zuckerman was talking about. Who has access to the data that allows for the targeting of the ads? I mean, the infrastructure access, there might be something fruitful there to talk about with regard to the press right.
We have some common themes that are working their way through some of the Q&A and chat questions that I think are super important for purposes of thinking about the wider themes of this conference. And it's something that I have seen as an undercurrent, but not openly expressed in some of the previous panels. And this is sort of tying together the jurisprudential culture for the press with the public culture for the press, the public reputation of the press. So one questioner ties together some of the language from the Silberman opinion that Jeff was citing to us earlier, notes that Judge Silberman said, this is, I'm reading this from this questioner. So this questioner says that that Silberman says, the First Amendment guarantees a free press to foster vibrant trade and ideas, but a biased press can distort the marketplace. And when the media has proven its willingness, if not eagerness, to so distort, it is a profound mistake to stand by unjustified legal rules that serve only to enhance the press's power. So this questioner is asking, have the attacks on the press, recent attacks on the press, including the attack on the press from Trump as the enemy of the people, have those kinds of attacks undermined the public consensus and even a judicial consensus about the special role of the press? I'm wondering the panelists' views on the interrelationship between some of the trends that we've been recognizing in this, in the wider conference here, and certainly the things that Martha and Sonja have been writing about, and the public and political environment for press trustworthiness. Martha, do you want to take a crack at answering the question? Have the attacks on the press as an enemy of the people undermined the public consensus about the special role of the press?
I think that we've had a president in office for 4 years who made the press an enemy without any resistance, any hesitation. Even before he was president, Donald Trump called the press enemy of the people, and he did so ramping it up to kind of a crescendo over the course of his presidency. This is a playbook that's used by tyrants around the world. We've seen this with Viktor Orban. We've seen this in the Philippines. We've seen this in other countries. It's not just the US. I don't know whether there's ever been a consensus about the press, but I am confident that steady attacks by a figure in high prominence, particularly the head of state on the press, has real damage, and real damage not only to the press, but to democracy.
Yes, Sonja, thoughts?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, and this is the one of the downsides of having your moderator for your panel be your frequent co-author. So I'll just have to say, RonNell, as you and I wrote in a piece that we did a few years ago at the beginning of the Trump administration, in part because of the under-recognition of constitutional protections for the press, but not completely so. But the press is overall levels of power and levels of protection have come from a number of non-legal sources as well. And part of the thing that is so concerning to us is that not only do we not have these legal or constitutional protections necessarily, but that we've seen there be attacks on a lot of these other pillars, these non-law or soft law pillars that had been, really bolstering the power of the press. And one of these was the obligation that it seemed that there once was for government officials to at least give credence to the rhetoric of the importance of the press, to at least come out and say that the work of the press is important, that freedom of the press is important, that this is one of the, crown jewels of our democracy and necessary for our democracy to work well, even if they then turned around and, complained about the press coverage or, it undertook some other actions that perhaps could be seen as hostile to the press. Nonetheless, having those public expressions is bolstering to our press and to our press rights. So when those went away under the Trump administration and indeed were replaced instead by these attacks, I think they had a very real harm on the power and the protection of the press, but also on, for a number of people anyway, on the trust that they held in journalists and in the news media.
If I can say, I think in addition to Donald Trump, the other factor that's contributed to this is the vast expansion of the ideology of the press. That is, if you go back 40 years, the vast majority of people got their news and information from relatively mainstream newspapers, magazines, TV shows, which were reasonably responsible. And today, with cable news and the internet, large portions of the American people get their news and information from highly biased sources and often inaccurate and unreliable sources, but they don't know that. And that's created, I think, a serious challenge to our democracy. There's always been disagreement among the people about a range of issues, but now it's gotten, I think, far crazier than it's been at any time in recent history, at least.
I want to pose a question from the Q&A from Tom Leatherberry. He asks, the press clause functions that you describe would include a broader set of individuals and organizations than the set covered by most state shield statutes. Could you envision constitutional challenges to those statutes by press members who are not defined as journalists under those statutes? And could those challenges be successful? So I think Tom's question is a really interesting one just in its concrete way, but also for sort of testing the wider scope of what we're thinking about here. How broadly would a doctrine driven by press function sweep in terms of what it permits and also what it requires?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I was suggesting earlier that one of the solutions to the unwillingness of the courts to interpret the press clause broadly, because it didn't want to have to decide who gets to invoke it, was legislation. But this creates exactly the question that's now been raised. And it's easy to imagine laws that we would all find unconstitutional, depending upon how they define reporters. And thus far, my sense is that, I haven't followed this closely, but my sense is that the laws have been fairly general, not ideological or viewpoint-based or anything like that. And courts have tended to give a reasonable degree of deference to the laws. But it is absolutely true that there are lines being drawn. You know, if you are a reporter for a newspaper that has a circulation of X thousands, you get to claim a privilege. But if you're under that, you don't get to claim a privilege. And that is, in some measure, discriminatory. Thus far, I think courts have tended to give deference to these laws, but they do pose potential problems, absolutely.
Sonja, do you have views on how your framework for invigorating the press clause would play out in some of those outer boundary cases?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, I do think that, and you know, as Martha was saying earlier, and we've been talking about that, this is a multi-pronged problem that needs to come at it from a variety of directions, including a strong legislative side of things. And in fact, as Jeff was discussing earlier in the Brandsburg cases and some of these other cases where the court has said, you know, we're not going to come in and say that there's a constitutional, you know, press clause right in this situation, they have affirmatively invited or encouraged the legislators to act, that this is, you know, essentially a legislative act, and that's where this power rightly belongs. And I think there is a lot of value to having the legislatures involved in this as political branches, particularly in being able to be more dynamic and to have the ability to you know, with more fluidity, perhaps, to embrace definitions that change over time as the core group of actors or entities who are fulfilling these functions has changed and will continue to change in the future. And I think a situation like that, though, then can fit in well with a role, perhaps a more general role for the court to be able to do what it already does, which is to police for viewpoint neutrality. So if we had a situation where we had a government statute or action that was not including certain members of the press because of things that they had written, because of the viewpoint they seem to have taken in their news gathering and in their press work, I think courts are already situated to be able to make that kind of distinction and to be able to do that kind of work. And I also think this is why, to me, I would have courts shift, though, their focus in thinking about the press clause and thinking about press functions away from the individual, expressive, often kind of anti-majoritarian framework that we're used to thinking about when we think about speech, and instead embrace this collective public interest framework, because I think they can use this kind of framework to ask the questions about, you know, whether in this situation the press functions are being fulfilled. Are these the actors who are best suited to fulfill that press function, and worry less about an individual versus an individual and more about protecting the entire functions themselves and thinking about them through the lens of making sure this public need as against the government and the powerful is being aptly protected.
Thanks. I wanted to draw upon a couple of themes that are being articulated in some of the chat and Q&A questions. to ask about the viability of the press clause as a mechanism for providing access, sort of looping back to some of the questions that we talked about earlier with the question about the immigration center, for example. One of the questions here is, does the press clause have a role to play in resolving cases like the Jim Acosta suit for the retaliatory removal of his press pass? And then other questions sort of related to that, to this access theme, are questions about how the kinds of things that we're talking about in this panel map onto some of the wider debates that we have had in previous panels about social media use. And what might feel like the exercise of the press function by either social media users or social media platforms. So the sort of wider question about line drawing in access cases, and what our press clause conversation has to say about these bigger debates of regulating media platforms that at least arguably, at least distribute the news, and at least arguably in some instances are involved in hosting what feels like news gathering. Thoughts about those questions? Sonja, do you want to tackle those, and then we can loop around? I think Martha's book has some interesting things to say about the way that it maps onto the wider platform regulation question, but maybe you can speak to the access question.
Sure. So, one of my big arguments I've really been trying to make is simply that I believe that the press clause as a textual part of the First Amendment is, as we view it through its very strong history of having this protection for the structural role of the press, and the press functions, as we've been talking about, simply need to be part of the constitutional discussion. So one of the things that concerned me, while the Jim Acosta case had a great outcome, and we, he got his press pass back, and he did so though based on a theory of due process, a First Amendment infused theory of due process, but nonetheless that they, he hadn't been given sufficient warning, that he didn't have sufficient sort of rules in place, notice about, what kind of behavior may or may not lead to you losing your press clause, to which we then had the administration turn around and put in place sort of the process, right? Here's the process that things you can't do, things you can't do. Luckily we didn't have a too aggressive use of that approach, but it did leave me wondering, what if there had been the process? What if we had the notice and the steps that you had gone through? Surely there's still another interest here. There's another press interest here that is not being part of the conversation because we have left this dormant protection on the floor. So that is sort of my plea, is just simply that I think this needs to be part of the balancing and part of the analysis, part of the interests that are being considered, rather than doing what we're doing now, which is, protecting the press often, but doing so sometimes through a back door or through a sort of a side implicit approach.
Martha, thoughts about how this correlates to the advocacy that you've been engaged in about infusing the press clause into conversations that might otherwise be taking place, particularly in the sort of wider debates about regulating social media platforms that distribute the news, about the ways that it should be acknowledged and spoken of in the course of those wider policy debates?
Well, I don't think I have much to illuminate who should count as press when a blogger may be following a very important activity that nobody else is. We know that in state capitals all around the country, there's no one reporting, as is true about in courtrooms where there's no reporters anymore. So it may be bloggers are the best we have, and I don't know whether we make any progress in the underlying functions to articulate their rights of access under the press clause as opposed to under the speech clause. But where I've been thinking about this, and so thank you for the question, is much more about the platforms themselves, which, for many years from their founding until about a year ago, were insisting they're not in the news business. They're not journalists. They don't do this. They're kind of backing off from that. They also insisted until relatively recently that they didn't do any editing, which also was not true, because of course they do, and whether it's algorithmic or human. I think that the assertion by the platforms of First Amendment freedoms is perfectly within their right. They can articulate that. And I think actually I don't support the kind of application of Marsh versus Alabama and metaphors of kind of private town to justify regulating or to justify actually restricting any kind of moderation by the platforms. I don't think that's a good idea. I think they're private. They should be understood as private and be able to assert First Amendment rights the same way that the Washington Post can. But having said that, I think that what's stunning is the lack of responsibilities and the failure to undertake any responsibilities, which include, how about paying for the news that third parties post? So I think that the broken piece, not only in the doctrine, but also in the finance, is news gathering. This is a connection to the prior panel. I think that there really should be enforcement of both intellectual property and other laws like theft, so that the news gathering and the news production of journalism is paid for. And if there are laws or efforts that go after that and those are restricted, I think there's a place for the press clause to be asserted.
Yeah, that's helpful. I wanted to just use this maybe as we will continue this conversation with some additional voices, and I hope your voices sticking around in the next panel about defining the press for purposes of legal and constitutional protection. But I wanted to try to sort of round us out here by tying us back to something that was said in the very first panel, which was focused. It was populated by journalists and communication scholars, folks who are thinking about the sort of press that democracy needs, sort of what it is that we need to try to sustain in order to have a healthy American democracy. And I was trying to remember who it was, but somebody asserted that we might, I actually think it was Jay Rosen, asserted that we might need to think more carefully about the terminology that we use, and that there might be some real distinction between who is the media and who is the press, right? That we should think about those in careful ways. And I just wanted to sort of connect the dots and tie back to this group to see whether you all agree that there's some utility there in the linguistic choices that we make there. And if so, what's the difference? What's the difference between references that we make to the media writ large and when we are speaking of the press? Thoughts? Do people want to chime in on that?
I know that Jay said quite specifically, because I also took note of it, media is not journalism, he said. Media is the attention industry. Journalism is a social practice allowing knowledge of what is going on in the world beyond personal experience and is usually done by professionals. That's what he said. I like the definition, and I think the distinction matters. I'm not sure this focus on professionals is going to be so helpful, however. Certainly historically, we didn't have that as a concept. But I do think that this is a deeper problem than even our current crisis. You think back to the movie broadcast news, when the news activity of television and radio was subordinated to the entertainment divisions, there was a jeopardy to the independence and, if you will, allegiance to something other than making money. And this is a deeper problem, which is again why I think the emphasis on public infrastructure and multiple sources of revenue has to be pursued if the press is going to continue. Can't just be dependent on demand, can't just be dependent on the attention industry.
Sonja, final thoughts as we think about this distinction between the media as an attention industry and the press as something else.
Yeah, I liked his definitions a lot too, and I think it is important to keep this distinction. And it reminded me a bit of the debate about sort of what we mean when we think about protecting, what is it that the press clause protects, and the argument that, oh, the press in the First Amendment originally referred to the printing press, and therefore the modern analog to that would be mass communication technology. So therefore the modern analog to the press would mean it's protecting all of our rights to what today would be technology that's in our cell phones, and versus the interpretation, which I think is both historically supported and also far more important, in that the modern analogy to how the press was referred to and used and discussed originally isn't just this technology, and that would be sort of the media, right? You just have the ability to get to lots of eyes and ears, but rather these journalistic functions. And we've since had the rise of the act of journalism. It's a profession for some, it's a function that others fulfill, not in a professional capacity, but it's still important. And that this is what we need to make sure is being protected, because there's something very distinct and very important there.
Super. Well, thank you so much to our panelists for a rich doctrinal conversation, and especially for laying the foundation for a continued conversation that we'll pick up after a 15-minute break when we turn to the panel on who is the press.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.